All right, so it's a real pleasure to welcome Shamubeel Eaqub to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
And this is unusual because every other Seeds episode I've done, and there's more than 168 of them, has been in person. So I've always traditionally thought it was important to look someone in the eye to be able to ask hard questions or go, a bit deeper with people. But we live in unusual times, so I'm making an exception. And I'm really interested in your perspective as an economist on sort of what's going on in the world today, both looking through our New Zealand lens, but also just broader than that as well. Sort of what are we seeing around the world? And people who haven't listened to the podcast may not know, but normally I talk about people's backstories and where they're from. But in this case, I think it'd be nice if we just dive right in and we talk about COVID-19 and what we're seeing. So before we started recording, you were saying that this actually is your normal anyway, right? You kind of work from home.
I do. So, most of my colleagues are based in Wellington and I live in Auckland. So I have a home office and I have a usual routine of working in my study. And then I sort of pop out for lunch with my kids and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, for me, this is quite normal. But what has changed is so many more people are working from home that they're not demanding that I go see them in person. So I'm finding I'm actually more efficient in some ways because I'm able to get hold of everybody and have those conversations.
But maybe the world is catching up with where you've been for a while.
Well, it is and it isn't. I think in some ways that human interaction, that face-to-face is really important. And we're still monkeys in many ways. So for us, having that physical interaction, being able to see each other, gauge each other's perceptions and facial features, body language, has quite a lot of impact. But we know that in the absence of that, things like video conferencing and those kinds of things can be quite good alternatives. Certainly once you've met somebody. So I think it doesn't do away with the need for human connection, but we can find other ways to complement that physical meeting.
Yeah. And you can see that here, we're interacting on different islands and yet we're able to talk instantaneously and see each other. And it does help. I should have said as a background that we've known each other for a couple of months at least. Because we're both on a board together. And so that probably aids the interaction because we've sat around, we've strategized, we've had a couple hours, eating peanuts and chocolate together in a room. So
I think that makes a real difference because I think that initial getting to know somebody part, you don't have to do that over video, which is, I think, a bit awkward. But once you know somebody, it's quite easy to maintain that connection. So no, I feel like we are going to see a lot more of this happening even after this crisis blows over. We are going to be more comfortable with using this kind of technology. And it will mean that we are, I think, better connected than we have been. I think a lot of young people in particular are very good at doing this anyway, but this is going to become a norm for many more people.
Well, it's been a forced norm, hasn't it? Like I work in a law firm and all of a sudden we can't go to the office. It had to happen so quickly. And probably if you were rolling it out, you would say, well, we'll do this in a year, 2 years or something. But this was like, we have 5 days or less to actually implement it. So.
And, there are teething problems, but people are finding very good ways of working around issues. And in a crisis, we see that, right? There's lots of inventiveness and creativity that happens during crisis because there is an alternative. And I think there are a lot of, frightening things that are happening around the world with this infection and pandemic. And the way that I've sort of thought about it is when it first started, it was very much a China thing, right? It was happening in China and they were doing all these things. And when you were outside, it's very hard to get a sense of why are they so worried about it? What's going on? And it kind of felt a bit removed, right? And so when I was thinking about it from a perspective of New Zealand, it was very much an economic linkage story. It was about, well, what does it mean for our trade? What does it mean for imports? Those kinds of things. And then once the virus started to spread, you realize that actually it's not about our economic connections with China. It's actually a much bigger story in terms of what does it mean for the world that's dealing with this disease that is spreading everywhere. And we've seen in places like Italy, for example, just the devastating consequences of what happens if the disease is allowed to just unleash. And we have to think about these kinds of events as humans first, as a as an impact on humanity, and then think about the economic consequences.
Yeah.
And when I look at what New Zealand is doing relative to around the world, I feel pretty privileged to be living here right now.
Mm.
So we might argue that we should have moved a week earlier or whatever, but in reality, we are moving hard to essentially eliminate the disease from New Zealand.
Mm.
Everybody else is really looking at how do they mitigate and keep it low. We are trying to essentially eliminate it until a vaccine is available.
Yeah, it's
And
actually an interesting perspective, because I was having some exchanges with some people in the US, and I was explaining that I was in lockdown, I was at home, and they were expressing surprise, like, oh, like, is that really happening? And that in turn surprised me, because I think because I'm in the bubble here in New Zealand of what's going on, I guess maybe I'm not appreciating that other countries aren't taking the drastic steps, if you want to phrase it that way, that we've taken of actually lockdown.
yeah, and I think we are moving a lot more aggressively than other places. And there is a fear that if you move too aggressively, it will have this big impact on the economy and a big impact on essentially jobs and people's livelihoods. It's true, but the alternative is not better. Because if the disease is allowed to spread through a country like New Zealand, in a worst case scenario, we might lose 80,000 people to the disease. And in a normal year, we only lose about 40,000 people, just under actually. So the number of deaths in New Zealand could double. I mean, just the societal impact of that kind of devastation for our population. We're talking about our friends, parents, and grandparents. These are not randoms. These are people that we are actually connected to.
Yep.
So I don't think that's really an option. But also there is a misconception that if we delay our actions, that the economy will be better, that we will have more businesses around and more jobs. I don't think that's true. I think the best possible course that we could take is try and eliminate the disease. And that period is really quite painful. And we should have all the supports that we can to preserve jobs and businesses. And when we come out of it, we will be in a new normal, because we'll still have relatively closed borders, and previously very important industries like tourism just will not be as big as they were. So we will see some really big dislocating changes coming through. But I think that is a better option than having a situation where people lose faith in their leaders, people lose faith in the institutions and in each other. If we can't trust each other to be essentially not infecting you with a disease that might kill you, we'll all be acting with fear. And that is actually a worse thing for economy than anything else.
It's interesting as well, leaving aside the economic impact, the social impact that it's having, in the sense of, I've never heard an official sanction that we should be kind to each other. It's like, it's about humans relating to each other. It's almost like we're coming back to what is the essence of what makes us who we are. Rather than being focused on, well, the GDP, this percentage, it's more like and I think Jacinda Ardern is doing a great job of leading this approach of, and you saw it after the shootings in Christchurch as well, this sort of, we are one, let's come together, be kind to each other, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, really, when you think about the opposite would be a hard-nosed sort of money-only approach.
Yeah, and I think New Zealand has shown that approach over successive crises. So I recall the Christchurch earthquakes we had quite a few years ago now, and the overwhelming reaction was one of solidarity, of collective action, that we want to help our friends and neighbors that have been affected by it. And that's the right reaction. And I think we've seen the same following the shootings in Christchurch, and we've seen the same with what's happening with this particular virus. And collectivism is quite an important part of getting through this stuff. And in many kind of economic models, we assume that people are selfish. And it's true that we have certain decisions that are made in very selfish ways, but also humans have extraordinary capacity for compassion, for solidarity, for collectivism. We may not all believe in it to the same extent, but we all buy into the wider structure of society. And I think that's kind of where we are. I look at what New Zealand represents. It largely represents a place that rubs along. We get along with each other, even if we have different viewpoints. And in crisis, we can really pull together.
Yeah, that's helpful. Do you think that there's something unique about New Zealand here, or is it somehow it's an island, right? Island nation, no other immediate borders. Like, what is it that makes it have that unique character?
Well, I don't know if we're unique. I think there is a common humanity that is coming through. And under the right leadership, I think we see it at its full. And like I said, it's not necessarily one leader, but it's the values that these leaders embody and they reflect of the country. I think by and large, New Zealand as a country holds values that are fairly collective, that we do look after each other. We might argue about how much and in what way, but I think we have a basic understanding and belief that we're all in this together. Yeah. I think part of it is about being small, part of it's about being isolated. I think there's a sense of distance where being with each other is really important. But I think first and foremost, it's the humanity in all of us. I don't think we're that unique in that sense.
Yeah, no, that's good. So can we go back in a time machine to when we last met, which was about a month ago? And at that time, this was kind of in the newspaper, but as a little byline. It was definitely not the front page, and I was definitely not working from home. Can you just take us through your own journey of becoming aware of this, maybe at the start of the year? I'm not sure when that was. And like you said, what you thought the impact would be as a trading nation. And then take us through to today and sort of what you're seeing and what you think the impact will be.
It's a good question. And so really, we started talking about this COVID-19 in February in New Zealand. So we didn't have any cases, but we could see what was happening in China, in particular in Wuhan. And I was really worried because China is such a big trading partner for us. So that direct connection really made me very worried. So I was sort of looking back through history and thinking, well, this might be very similar to what we saw during SARS. But our economic connections are probably 6 times bigger. So that was my starting point. About a week later, it became very clear that it was going to spread a bit wider. And I thought, no, but they're going to learn from what happened in China, and we're going to stamp it out. So it's going to be a short, sharp thing. So I thought maybe we'll see something like what happened during the global financial crisis. And then a week later, it became evident that actually we're not following in the footsteps of what China did quite late when they had the lockdown and strict quarantine testing, all those bits and pieces. Instead, we're going to learn the same lessons and have the same mistakes. And it has become increasingly clear that what we're looking at now is probably more akin to what we saw during the Great Depression rather than what we've seen during the GFC. And to give you a bit of context, a normal, a GFC recession in New Zealand would mean our unemployment rate might go to, say, from 4% to 6%.
Yeah.
So we might lose 80,000 jobs. But if you look at the Great Depression, the official estimate was 15%, and the unofficial estimate was 30%. And we're talking about widespread destruction of businesses and jobs and scarring of people's lives, particularly young people, because their careers are destroyed, and they just have a much later start in life. And everything that we're doing right now should be about minimizing the impact of the disease. But we have to think very hard about how do we come out of this as strongly as possible. So we're going to have to spend an extraordinary sum of money when it comes to the stimulus from government, fiscal stimulus, but also what the Reserve Bank, the central bank, can do in terms of printing money, whatever they can. We're talking pushing the boat out, no boundaries, try new stuff, be as aggressive and bold as possible, because this is quite truly the biggest economic and social challenge that we have faced since the Great Depression.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I remember my grandmother, she was in America during the Great Depression, and she described, for example, on Christmas, they would get a piece of fruit, that was their present. But that was quite unusual because of the circumstances that they were going through. And my great-grandfather, he ended up working for something called the CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps in America, which was basically part of a public works regime that they were doing, building parks and national parks and all types of infrastructure. And I think that was one of the things that they were doing to kind of drag people out of the depression and give people jobs. Can you just describe then for us, just, I like where you're going with this, blue skies thinking. This is something that's quite unique and unusual. What would be some of your takes on how we can have unique responses to something that is so big?
Yeah, I think part of it's around essentially, again, going back to the values of what is it that we want to achieve. I think we want to have, one of the sort of big things in economics is about efficiency, but the other part of efficiency is equity and fairness. So I think we've been quite focused in the last few decades around efficiency as opposed to fairness. And here is a time when we know that a lot of the impact of this recession, however deep it might be, will be worst felt by those people at the bottom of the heap. So actually having initially a very big focus on the social safety net to make sure that those people have some dignity, that those people are well looked after, is going to be absolutely critical. But I think we're going to have the kinds of, not so blue skies, but perhaps a rhythm and a rhyme of what happened in the 1950s. The post-war thinking that was very future focused. They were thinking 100 years out, not about what's going to happen in 1 or 5 years' time. And that's the kind of thinking we want to see. I want us to invest in the social and physical infrastructure of New Zealand. That's going to look after for our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, because that's the opportunity that we have now.
So just thinking about the 1950s and the post-World War II stimulus and various things that were done, I'd love to just hear a bit more about that, but having the overlay of something that we've already hinted at throughout this conversation, which is looking at our humanity, looking at what's fair. You and I got to know each other through an initiative called Community Finance, which is looking at social housing for people who would not have access to houses, and saying, can we connect philanthropic funders with the providers of that social housing? And so I know we're on the same page here, thinking about how can we do that in an equitable way. But what I'm wondering is, could this also be a watershed moment for the conceptions and the paradigm of thinking around economics and jobs and business as we move from maybe the pre-COVID-19 days to the future, and what that might look like in terms of how we might change in a new way of thinking?
Yeah, I think it's already changing our thinking a bit. And let me sort of maybe provide a few examples. One will be around our thinking of resilience. So we've been very focused on short-term gains, making things quick, fast, cheap, but we don't think about resilience and building in capability so that if a bad thing happens, we're able to essentially go on as well as we can. And it relates to our stocks of medical supplies, our food supplies, how much capacity we have, our network infrastructure, all of those kinds of things. So just that thinking that actually there is an important part of resilience which is good for everybody. There is a public good that we should look after. That resilience thinking is really important. I think there is an element of, I guess, cooperation that comes through as well. A lot of the way that we think about politics and policymaking is about competition, is about essentially the winner takes all. Those are the kinds of principles that we embed in the way that we design our policies and our economy. And yet, when a crisis happens, cooperation is the most important part. So where do we draw the line when it comes to things like our essentially underlying values, when it comes to things like competition versus cooperation? Because actually cooperation is probably a stronger force during periods of crisis than competition. So cooperation is going to become, I think, a very big part of how we think about things going forward, across organizations, within industries, between government departments, but also, again, across countries. One of the most frustrating things that we've seen with the COVID-19 response is the individual national approaches to dealing with it. Yet we know that countries who've experienced it have good lessons and good ways of dealing with things so that we don't all make the same mistakes. And yet we're all doing it on our own with our own experts at a vast amount of cost and duplication. And yet our level of trust in each other is so low that multilateralism and coordination and cooperation is not happening. I hope that one of the lessons that comes out of this is that cooperation is absolutely important. And the final sort of example probably for me is this will show the underlying fault lines of our society. The impact on renters, on the poor, the vulnerable, the sick is going to be magnified significantly over the course of coming months. I hope that wakes us up to what we actually stand for and whether or not we actually have the infrastructure, whether it's in our health system or in our housing system or in our welfare system, to be able to deal with that, or even with charities. And that final one is really important for me because what holds us together, what sort of defines us as, as a population, is our ability to look after the most vulnerable. And this will be the time that I think we'll test that a lot. We tell ourselves in New Zealand that we're an egalitarian, caring country, but I think we'll find that actually many of our policies, many of the things that we do are in fact incredibly mean and incredibly destructive.
No, that's helpful. So just reiterating that, the first thing would be that we're going to focus on resilience. That would be important. The second is cooperation. The third is learning from others and actually taking on board their experiences. And the fourth would be a focus on the vulnerable and how we can actually make things more equitable. Sounds like those are some of the key elements.
Yeah, and for me, the final one is probably one that is the most important, because if you manage to look after the most vulnerable, it means everybody's doing okay.
Yeah. Right,
because they're the people at the sort of at the vulnerable end. They magnify the pressures that the entire population is facing. So if we're able to look after those people at the bottom, it means we've actually looked after everybody.
So is there any terminology that would be helpful for us to consider when you look back at the history of economics and think about how we've traditionally understood it? The word that I'm wondering about is the word the human economy, or something like that. Looking not just at the economy as in numbers and GDP and interest rates and those sorts of things, but actually saying there's a lot that we haven't traditionally looked at when we come to this. And part of that is the well-being of our people. And I guess we see that a little bit. There's some green shoots, isn't there? The well-being budget and Treasury's focus on more factors than just the interest rates. But do you have any thoughts on that, or what sort of terminology is helpful?
I do, and I think partly it's a reimagination of why we do things. And so there's quite a lot that's been written about these kinds of things. So we've got some recent work by people like Kate Raworth, people like Mariana Mazzucato. They've been really about focused around what is the role of wider society in the economic system, right? So because the economy is not there for itself, it's there to serve a purpose for humanity. It's for us to have better lives, and more of us to have better lives. And we're seeing a little bit of that in places like in New Zealand, in Treasury, for example. Their thinking around well-being, I think, is very good. The same kind of thinking is happening inside the OECD and in other places too. So it's an emerging area, and I think one that will get a lot more traction in coming months. But I think more important than terminology is what is the kind of the underlying philosophy that guides us. So economics is just one tool, and we shouldn't overplay the importance of that, because economists don't know very much. We can help, give you comparators, we can help you think about issues, we can give you the arguments for and against, but at the end, there is still a value judgment that should be based on something that is more fundamental. And I think the word that we're looking for is probably a word like love. That has to be your guiding principle. So there has to be an element of, why are we making these decisions? Would it be consistent with an approach where, we in our center is a word like love? And I think for me, it's quite a funny story, because, before the last election, I was on TV and I said, I think tax is love, right? And I got a lot of flack for that, because, there were a whole bunch of hardcore right-wing nutters who were like, tax is not love, tax is theft. And it was quite interesting seeing that debate play out. And the reason why I said tax is love is because that's the way we look after everybody without any conditions. We don't judge whether or not the person in a different city is going to get help from us. We just say that we're going to pay our taxes, and that takes care of our collective responsibility. And during a crisis, that becomes really clear that our ability to have a collective response is actually what holds us together. And right now, I don't see anybody saying tax is theft. Everybody's putting their hand out and saying the government should be spending lots of money rescuing businesses and households and all those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
In a crisis, we're all socialists. But I just hope that we learn these lessons and remember this when the time has changed, that actually it's really important that there is a minimum level of collectivism that's important. And collectivism is not quite the right word. I think it's love. It is about for all of us without any conditions.
No, that's good. I like it. I find sometimes words themselves get in the way, don't they? And actually what we're talking about is the essence of the human experience. And one thing I think that we're learning is to have empathy for strangers. Certainly, the reality is something like this could impact you. It could impact me. It's invisible. We can't see it. It would be different if it was like, here comes a bus and that silly person is standing right there. Whereas this, it's that maybe primordial fear, because we can't stop it. It's kind of in the environment around us. But the point is that through that, we then relate with others, because it could have been us. It could easily be us. So yeah, no, I like that. And I guess the question is, how do we build the foundation for the future, for your kids, for my kids, that takes the learning from everything that we're going through now and starts to build constructs that is maybe more regenerative, and a regenerative focus rather than an extractive focus.
And I think that's where that 100-year focus is really important, because the scale of the rebuilding of this economy and this nation is going to be very big. And if we focus only on the future of my generation, for example, we will be too short-sighted. This is when we say we're going to make investments now that will repay dividends in 100 years' time. So actually investing in climate resilience, investing in sustainability, investing in us, essentially leapfrogging all these things that have been holding us back for a number of years through legacy industries, legacy processes. It's time to deal with those kinds of things, because it's an opportunity to do those things. And in many ways, when you do those things, it shows a commitment to future generations. And that in and of itself is the change in the paradigm that you're talking about. I don't think it needs to be explicitly said or formalized into something. It needs to be reflected in the actions that we take. What are we doing that's going to essentially say, yes, we're going to look after our vulnerable. Yes, we're going to look after future generations. Yes, our system of taxation, our system of benefits are going to be fair and equitable. These are all things that, again, possess that one kind of thing in the middle, that empathy that you talked about, or the love that I talked about. Personally, I prefer love over empathy, because nobody says, honey, I empathize with you. We say, honey, I love you, right? Because that's the feeling that we experience as the human experience. I think even empathy kind of gives us a sense of distance. I want us to have no distance. I think it's okay for us, all of us, to be in this together, because it is about having no distance. It's about having no barriers. And I suspect that is what we, optimistically, I hope that is what we're going to see.
And it's interesting, because I think you and I have talked about this before, but there are green shoots that were already there. I look at the work of Akina Foundation, looking at social enterprise. I've done a lot in that space, as you know, and looking at business actually having a fundamentally different driver, where it's not purely about what the return is to shareholders. It's also looking at, hey, what's the impact of this organization? And if it's a profitable business, maybe it's not actually the right business, because it's making something that fundamentally is not helpful, and so having that lens on things is important. And then the other green shoots that I've seen recently is the focus on impact investing, this idea that people are actually interested in investing in a way that has returns beyond the financial returns. And you and I have talked about that before with community finance and, social housing. People are interested in that. And then the other thing I see is the rise of like consumer choice. that people are actually taking seriously that if I buy this shampoo as opposed to that shampoo, I'm having an impact. So the value of the dollar. And I think all of it, those are just some of the many examples of what I think has been a paradigm shift of thinking that's occurring. And what I'm hopeful of is that what we're going through now is just going to be able to accelerate that so that those green shoots can actually thrive and prosper, and more people can realize that there is another way of doing things.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, my great hope is that during this month of the lockdown, we'll realize that we spend our money on a lot of stuff that we don't actually need. Mm-hmm. And, consumerism is probably the biggest threat to humanity. We are consuming ourselves out of this planet. So we talk about carbon emissions and that kind of stuff. That's the outcome of us consuming too much. So if we actually reduce our consumption, that will do a lot more than any other mitigation strategy, right? And I hope that a lot of the things that we're experiencing now sticks, because that's what we saw after the Great Depression. People learned how to make do and making things last longer. So there's an element of that I hope that it sticks. I think we'll also see some really positive changes around how people work. I think we'll see a lot more working from home, a reduction in how much people travel, because we know that one of the biggest sources of pollution and greenhouse gases is transport. So being able to do less of that, still do it when we need to, but reducing even some of it, reducing the peak would be enough to have a really big impact on essentially improving our quality of air and the future of the planet. So, I'm quite optimistic in terms of there will be lots of these unintended consequences that might be positive. I just hope that they stick, because we tend to be quite lazy as humans, right?
Yeah,
We
take the crisis.
And also, I wanted to sort of chat about the business thing. You're right in that there's quite a lot of businesses that are doing social impact and those kinds of things. But also through this crisis, we're seeing a large majority of businesses are doing the right thing. They're keeping their staff on, they're looking after their customers, they're looking after their suppliers. So yes, we have our businesses to make profits, but when the going gets tough, we don't look after number one. For most businesses that I'm speaking to, they're also trying to look after their staff and their suppliers and their customers. So I think there's quite a lot of that's embedded, but we don't see it very often. I would like to see that being expressed more often, because the sharing of those values and the sharing of that kindness is actually really helpful, because it strengthens the bonds and makes your business much stronger.
I agree with you, but maybe that is one of the lessons, is that we're seeing the best part of humanity come out as a result of a crisis like this. And
some of the worst.
And the worst, yeah. And the question is, can we keep that, or can we keep the best bits of what we're seeing beyond the crisis?
Yeah. I think we will see some of this stick, and it may dissipate over time, but I think you remember the people who helped you out in your time of need. And people don't forget that stuff easily. So I think there will be some of it that will linger for quite some time. There'll be a lot of goodwill that will be built up over the course of this month and coming months. Yep. Those people who have done right by their customers and their suppliers and their staff, they'll earn a level of loyalty that I think most businesses would struggle to have in normal times. So those who have the cash flow, who can exist, they're not threatened with death. Just from a business perspective, I think those businesses have a real opportunity to create a very, very strong amount of goodwill and loyalty. And that will be based on something real, not a marketing and PR spin, right? Because quite often that kind of stuff is built on PR, but this is not about PR. You're judged by your actions. Yeah. And again, for me, it's just speaking from experience, the number of businesses that have been so forthcoming, that have been good with dealing with their staff and their suppliers and customers, that we will see some of that really taking place over coming years.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Well, one of the main things I've loved about our conversation is we're talking about economics, but it boils down to love, which I think is great. That would be awesome if we could rebuild on that foundation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just economics, right? I think it's that should be the guiding principle for how we deal with each other. So, we might all choose a different word that suits our personality, but whether it's kindness or empathy or love, I think having something that is quite wholesome in terms of what you're trying to achieve, it just makes it so much easier, because it's easy to give and you expect nothing in return. And when you get something in return, it's just a bonus.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I read Brene Brown's book recently, where she talks about values and articulating your two values, and that then becomes like your North Star. And then all your actions center around, is this consistent with my values? Which it's very simple, really, but how many of us actually articulate, what do I stand for? What do I believe? What am I doing? Does it line up with my ultimate values? So,
What are
is there
your
anything else that you wanted to cover off, Shamubeel? In
I
any
wanted
other
to know
thoughts you
what
got?
your two values are.
My two values? Well, actually, I had to have three because I couldn't fit them all in just two. So, my first one was about empowering positive change. So I really wanted to empower, positive change. The second one was about creativity, that everything I do, I want to have creativity flowing through it. And the third one was helping others whenever I can. So those, to me, if I can line up with those, I'm helping to empower positive change. I'm doing it in a creative way, whether it's a podcast or whatever, and I'm making it accessible for others. Those were kind of my values. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's just nice to hear what God drives other people.
Yeah. I actually did a blog post about it. Maybe I'll link to it in the thing. But yeah. Well, thank you so much. Was there anything else you wanted to cover? Or?
No, I mean, I think the main thing is look after yourself, look after your loved ones, look after your neighbors, because we're all in this together. And this crisis will pass, and we'll come out of this. And I think we'll come out of this stronger.
Yeah. Great. Well, I really appreciate your time. I know it's the 31st of March as we record this. So just to give the context of what we're facing. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
No worries.